Hello, and welcome once again to Family Historian. My name is Stephen Conte. Was your ancestor a miner? Well, if he was, this is definitely the show to watch, because on tonight's show, we're going to look for your miner ancestor. And joining me on tonight's show, I am very honored to have as my guest a wonderful man. His name is Doug Francisco. Doug is a direct descendant of many of the early families of New Jersey, in particular Robert Treat, who was the founder of Newark, New Jersey. Back in the 70s and 80s, Doug worked as a zinc miner right here in New Jersey. And now let's go deep into the bowels of the earth and go mining for ancestors with Doug Francisco. Doug, welcome to my show.
Thank you, Steve. This is great. Thanks for the invitation.
I want to thank you right now for emerging from the mine to give us your knowledge. You know, I did a lot of preparation for tonight's show, and I never realized that the occupation, the profession of mining goes back thousands of years. Mm-hmm. They have found paintings of Egyptian miners on the walls of caves, and the ancient Greeks as well.
True.
So you come from a very long heritage of miners.
Right.
Right. Now, before we get into the history of mining in New Jersey, because that's where you have done your mining, take us way back in time. Who were the first white miners in New Jersey?
Right. All right. Well, the native Indians, the Lenape, hunted and fished along the banks of the Wallkill River.
Right.
And many arrowheads, a lot of axe heads, and all sorts of Indian artifacts have turned up there. Mm-hmm. They were pushed out by the Dutch in the early 1600s, and the Dutch actually came over with the instructions to find minerals to bring back for the benefit of the Netherlands and the Dutch. They thought our outcropping of zinc was copper. Mm-hmm. So those were the first people interested in the ore beds of Franklin and Sterling, and Franklin and Ogdensburg.
That's where you have done your mining.
Yes,
in
correct.
Ogdensburg, Sussex County, New Jersey.
Correct.
Which is a very enchanting place to visit, and we'll get to that later on in our show. You also mentioned that at one time there were many mines in New Jersey. How many were there?
Little known fact that New Jersey in its history has had over 400 mines. Most of them were iron mines, 390 maybe. A couple were tin, a couple were copper, but there were only 2 zinc mines.
And you are a zinc miner?
Correct.
Okay. We don't have coal mines in New Jersey.
Correct.
Because of the geology.
Geology, correct.
Okay, very good. Now, after the Dutch, who were the next people to do mining in New Jersey?
The Dutch tried to treat our ore. It was the reddish color, and they thought it must be a derivative or something to do with copper. It didn't behave like the copper they knew, and they kind of abandoned that project. 100 years later, the French Huguenots came along and discovered that in that zinc ore there was iron properties. So they actually threw the zinc away, ground it all up and threw that away, but kept the franklinite and the other components that made iron. So they were mildly successful at iron mining.
That was the French Huguenots.
Yes, in the middle of the 1700s.
Now we get into the next century, 1800s, and who comes in next to be miners?
The English came over and took over from the Huguenots. And they know that the French were there in the 1750s because some of the old workings, they didn't have the technology to go underground at that time.
Right.
So what they did was mine on the surface, quarry mining. And they found old pits with 100-year-old trees growing in them, which told them scientifically that somebody was there 100 years previous. The English at that point had discovered the properties of zinc, knew that this was not copper, and it was not pure iron. It had other material benefits to it, and that was the zinc. And
what was zinc used for?
The first uses of zinc was in pigment, paint pigment, which took the place of lead. Even back in the early 1800s, they knew that lead was dangerous and bad for you, and they needed a replacement for it, and zinc was the perfect answer for that.
And I just happen to have right here 2 beautiful pieces of zinc. Can you tell us about this and the properties of this one right here?
That's a hand-collected specimen. I remember finding that and saying, oh, I used to take a big piece and see a crystal in it and try to make it smaller by tapping it with a hammer, and I'd end up breaking it. And this one I left alone, and it, collectors like that sort of stuff.
And this one right here, you could be a souvenir shopper while you're mining, is that right?
A lot of people did that. A lot of people have extensive collections of our fabulous ore.
And this one right here.
That has a lot of zincite in it. It's very heavy, you can feel that. The white is calcite, the country rock, the host rock for the zinc. There's black is franklinite, there's green willemite in there, all sorts of.
Now when you say franklinite, there was another mine in northern New Jersey. What mine is that?
Yes, we were at Sterling Hill, which is a sister mine of Franklin Furnace Mine.
Right.
So the 2 towns are 2 miles apart, and people always thought the ore bodies must be connected somehow, but there were 2 separate ore bodies.
Right.
They over the years they took out 22 million tons of Franklin ore and 11 million tons at Sterling Hill. So.
And your Sterling Hill mine in Ogdensburg, New Jersey, has the distinction of being an underground mine for how many years?
It was underground continuously for 130 years. It's one of the 5th oldest mines in the country, so it's got a tremendous history, with its workers that built the towns around it, and the extent of the ore bed and the quality of the ore.
Right. Now let's skip ahead to the 1890s, early 1900s.
Okay.
When you had the stream of immigrants coming in.
Yeah.
And mining was an occupation they all went for. Can you tell me who these people were?
Most of the workforce were immigrants. They were the Italians, the French, the Slovaks, the Hungarians.
Eastern European.
Eastern Europeans. And little known fact also that huge mines all over the world, but in the northern United States, in Michigan, vast iron mines, but most of the laborers there were from Norway and Sweden and Denmark. Scandinavia.
Right.
But New Jersey, the East Coast, attracted the Eastern European bloc countries.
Right. And there was another ethnic group that came in. The Cornish. Tell our viewers about the Cornish miners, who are miners par excellence.
Yes, they were the upper echelon of the mining industry because of their extensive coal mining in England. So the Cornish miners came over, and they graduated immediately to boss positions, shift bosses, mine foremen. Because of their knowledge, they could direct the immigrants under them.
And I remember when I came on your tour at the Sterling Hill Mining Museum, which I loved, we ate pasties.
Yeah.
And that is a Cornish delicacy. Can you tell us what that is?
It's a meat pie, basically, but it travels well. So the wives would make this meat pie for their miner husbands, wrap it up in brown paper, probably. Stick it in their lunchbox, and it would travel well and keep well, and they could eat that underground. That was a favorite.
Right. Yeah. Now, let's go forward now. The life of the miner, and you have lived that life. And there were various jobs that you guys did. You just did not become a miner when you were hired.
Right.
So I'm going to read these off to you, and you can define them for us, okay? What is a hand mucker?
The ore, the broken ore, that anything called ore is something that can be removed from the earth for money, for profit.
Right.
So ore, you didn't blast it down and just take half of it. You had to get every last scrap. So you would hand muck. Usually machines did a lot of the heavy lifting, so to speak. But when there was stuff left on the ground, they didn't want to see any of it left. That's why we were there, to get that ore. So you would hand muck. You would on your hands and knees with a shovel,
And that's the beginner job.
that's the beginner job.
Okay, and then you could graduate to a helper. Tell our viewers what that entailed.
Hand mucking, helping kind of are synonymous, but there's a pecking order. There's a you graduate. You went from a hand mucker to a helper, and that was helping a drill runner, changing his steels, bringing in equipment for him, and he's running the drill, and you're his helper.
Great.
So,
And then we have the timberman.
early mining in Franklin, and probably universally early mining, was the ground was propped with timber. They did not have technology. Now we have roof bolts. We can insert metal rods and tighten them up and hold the ground in place. But in the early days, they needed timber. And the timber industry actually flourished regionally around Franklin and Ogdensburg. They had extensive properties in the forest, and they had whole crews out cutting timber, bringing them to the mines for the timberman to install, to prop up the ground.
But nowadays they don't have the timberman, do
No,
they? In some
no,
mines,
no.
no. Now we have the drill runner, which I'm sure you have done very often.
There weren't too many days where you didn't have a drill in your hand and a stick of dynamite to put in the hole that you just drilled. So yeah, drill running is just what it says. You're running a drill.
I see. And then you become a miner.
A miner. Yep.
Okay.
And a miner had to have knowledge of everything. He had to be able to do all of the jobs underneath him and be proficient at his job. Development work, drilling and driving, the tunnels and the raises. A tunnel, a drift is a horizontal access way, and a raise is a vertical raise from a level to a level.
Would you say this is a learning on the job?
Yes.
Learning as you go along?
Absolutely.
You would have a more seasoned miner teaching you this?
Yeah, yeah. It's kind of probably like a lot of occupations where you don't just walk in and grab a drill and start drilling a hole.
Right.
And the mines took very good care of their workers, because you didn't go home and read a book about how to put a hole in and how many sticks of powder. You had to learn by experience.
Right.
So they took care of their miners. They built a world-class hospital in Franklin, one of the first hospitals in New Jersey. They had bowling alleys and camps for the kids, and they really took good care of the miners because they wanted them to stay.
Right. Now, when you were a miner, did you have to go through all of these jobs before you became, when they said, right now, Doug, you're a miner?
Sure. And with each one of those increments in responsibility was an increment in pay. So it might only be a quarter an hour, but you took pride in becoming a miner. It was you were proud of that, because you'd been through all the, the ladder rungs to get there. So
now we do have a very fine book here, Mining for America, written by a Dr. William R. Truran.
Correct.
And can you tell our viewers about this book? I know it's a very fine book. I did not read all of it. It has lots of photos.
Yeah.
And would you call it a very concise work on mining in New Jersey?
Yes. Specific. Well, this book is specific to New Jersey. Mr. Truran actually had a great-grandfather who was a miner, and uncles and nephews and all sorts of his family history.
And they were Cornish.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, originally, yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
And I think it goes back to his great-grandpa, who was a Cornish miner.
But he has interviews with local people, and he talks about his great-grandfather's work, and he's very thorough in that book. I enjoy it.
So you would recommend this book
Absolutely.
right here? Okay.
Yep. Specific to the mines in Franklin and Ogdensburg.
Right. And now we have another book. I did not see this book before. It's called A Mile Deep, and you've been more than a mile deep, I'm sure, in your mining career.
Cumulatively, yeah.
Right. A Mile Deep and Black as Pitch by Carrie Papa. Is that correct?
Yep.
Okay.
And those are in-person interviews, an oral history, where she went and got 25 miners and miners' wives or people who worked in the zinc company as secretaries. But the gentleman on the cover there was my mine foreman when I worked there.
Were you interviewed for this book?
No, I wasn't.
Okay, you're not that old.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
But this will give first-hand accounts of the life of the miner.
Also very interesting because they go back, genealogically speaking, they go back through grandfathers and people who came over.
Wonderful.
And the villages they lived in. I'm calling them villages. They were all in Ogdensburg, but there was Mexico Town, and they brought Mexicans up in cattle cars to when the mine needed more people.
Right.
Yeah. So
isn't that something?
Yeah.
So they would import all these foreign people to work in the mines.
And they would have their own enclaves within the town of Ogdensburg. So there was Mexico Town, there was Siberia, there was Hunky Town. I don't know if that's correct to say.
Hungarians.
Hungarians,
okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
You know, I've seen those settlements on the map.
Okay.
I think I even saw one called New Russia or something like that
Could
up in Sussex.
Could well be.
But those were the ethnic neighborhoods.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And I guess all the ethnic guys stood with each other. There was
I mean, they got along. Once you go underground, everybody's your friend. You could have all sorts of disagreements on the surface. Be ready to punch somebody one minute and get on the cage and go underground, and then somebody was always there to help you.
But you guys had a great brotherhood and a great camaraderie.
Absolutely.
Once you're under the ground. And do you still see many of your miner buddies?
We have an annual Miners' Day, and sadly, one by one, somebody's missing every year as time goes by.
Right.
But that is an annual event, and I look forward to it.
Great. So. Let's get to the genealogy part now and finding our miner ancestor. And you told me that there were very good sources to use. And what is the first source that one would use?
Well, you're going to start locally. I mean, now with the computer, everything is kind of local, really, when you think about it. But you can go to your local historical society. And Ogdensburg has a fabulous one because the town was built around the mine. So a lot of their focus is the people who built the mine, built the town, built them. Right.
And speaking of local historical societies, I've seen photos, and this is kind of sad, between the years 1850 to the 1930s, young boys worked in the mines before the child labor law. Can you tell our viewers about that, how young they were? And
there are records of in the coal mines in Britain, in England, as young as 4 years old, working as breaker boys. And breaker boys, you'd get a chunk of coal and it would go through a machine which broke it up smaller and run down a conveyor belt, and hundreds of these children, literally children, 4, 5, 6, 10. Their job was to pick the debris out of the coal, pick a rock or a stick or whatever it was.
To break it.
It was already broken. They weren't actually cracking the rocks, but they were called breaker boys because that material came from a breaker, and they just sat there all day long, 12 hours a day. Dusty conditions, horrible conditions for anybody, but specifically for children.
And in your particular mine, long before you came along, there were breaker boys. Is that correct?
That was a terminology, breaker boys. Their job was to, and the mine didn't go out and hire 10-year-olds to work. They didn't advertise, we need more 10-year-olds. What they did was, if a father got hurt, broke his leg, had an injury where he couldn't work anymore, he was allowed to bring his son in to hold his spot. So that child wasn't drilling and blasting, but he was doing menial. He was feeding the mules. They used mules to pull the cars out. He might hold the vent doors open for airflow, fill their lamps up with oil. But in the 1916s, they actually came out with the first child labor law. But it only lasted a few years. It was overturned, and it wasn't until the 1930s when they had the official law came out. It was approved, and everybody had to follow that. So 1930s was the end of child labor.
But as young as 4 years old.
That was in England. There are reports of that.
Isn't that something? Now, we'll get back to our local historical society. We're using the Ogdensburg Historical Society and Museum as an example. And they have very good sources. And we have one right here. And can you tell us what this is? That you got at the local historical society?
This is one page out of many pages, and it interests me because I'm reading names here of people of relatives of these people, maybe sons or juniors or
What year
cousins.
is this?
This is 1932.
Okay, fine.
Like that. So the very first name is Novak. I worked with a Novak. This is M. Novak. I worked with Stevie Novak. So it is local, and I recognize Stahl here and Talmadge. I worked with Stalls and Talmadges. And you can also read the ethnicity of a lot of these Martinovic and Regovic, and so there's a lot of Hungarian and Czechoslovakian names in here.
Eastern European. That's
Right,
great.
correct.
Okay. And we have another page here. And what do you call this where the guys are on? Is that a ladder they're on?
It's
or?
a man cage.
A man cage. And
it's our elevator to take us underground.
It takes you underground and then takes you back up.
Right.
Okay,
Hopefully,
great.
yes.
Yeah. And there are some names on here because the Historical Society will put the name with the photograph, which is excellent.
Right. A lot of them are just photos of men, and that does, if you're tracing your ancestor, it does you no good.
Right.
But a name will jump out at you, Lawrence Sliker. Oh, I had an uncle Sliker, and I had this, and he was a miner, and it helps you when the names are on here. Not so much to identify the people, but to trace your family.
Right.
To see where they...
And what other names? Give us some good ethnic names there.
Canton Wine, Begergrazi, Gankarsik, Decker. There's a lot of Deckers in here. There's 3 Deckers, and Decker is a Sussex County name. That's an old Sussex County name.
Right.
So
that's a very good source.
Yeah,
okay.
Absolutely.
And then what other source can we use? I know we have government sources now, and that would be what?
That would be the census.
All right, the good old-fashioned census.
Yep.
And this one we have is from, what year is that?
1900 census, Moosic, Pennsylvania.
And the reason I chose Moosic, Pennsylvania, my great-grandpa, his name was Michael, he's behind me on tonight's set, he worked in the, I think it was iron or coal mines of Moosic, Pennsylvania. He's not on this census, but if you can read some of those, I think we have about 4 names there.
These are John James, and his age was 45. And I read again John James. I said, well, that must be a misprint. But if you look carefully, he was 20. So that was a junior or the son of
father and son.
Okay. And it also goes as far as to tell you what their jobs were. So this just says iron miner. Like the helper and the timberman, there are different aspects, but they labeled him as an iron miner.
Right.
Both of them. David Meredith, 15 years old. Iron miner, and Thomas Jenkins, 40 years old, iron miner. And I think you have to be a little careful because a lot of immigrants changed their names when they came over. So you might be looking for a Jones, but it could have been Jones Zisserwich or something like that. Right. And their names might have been truncated or shortened. Right. So I guess as a genealogical detective, you have to be aware of that.
Yes, that's a good point to bring up. And we are going to show you 2 more visuals. One is of the 1930 census for Luzerne County in Pennsylvania, and the one for 1940 in Luzerne, Pennsylvania. And we've got miners all over the place. Carbondale is a big, that whole area of Pennsylvania. And we don't have any coal miners here, no coal mines in New Jersey.
It took 5 tons of coal to process 1 ton of our zinc ore. So we would send all our zinc to Palmerton, Pennsylvania, and where the coal fields are plentiful, and the coal is plentiful and cheap. Right. We don't have coal in New Jersey. So.
Right. There's one more source, archives. I don't know if we have any here in New Jersey for coal miners. I mean, I'm sorry, for miners in general, but I know in Pennsylvania they have a lot of anthracite, which is another word for coal.
Coal, yep.
They have museums and they have archives, and they even have an archive of all the anthracite accidents that took place.
Sure, yep. The MSA, or Mine Safety Health Administration, kept very detailed records of all injuries. A crushed finger, a rock fell on your foot, you got your ribs crushed. They kept accident logs. So that's another source of tracing
your ancestry. Okay.
Yes.
Now, Doug, let's talk about you and your career as a miner. When did you start this? What possessed you to begin doing this kind of work?
I would have thought that somebody would have told me there was a 2,500 foot deep mine in my backyard. I didn't know about this till after high school. 2 years out of high school, I had a friend who, word of mouth, somebody said, oh, I'm making really good money at the mine. Mine, you know, where is this mine you're talking about? And I went down there and applied, and the next day I got a job. I was surveying at the time. It was a slow period, and I thought I'd be there for a couple months until things picked up again. And 12 years later, I was still mining till the day it closed. So
Would you call these the happiest days of your life? You have fond memories.
it was a cartoon adventure, climbing down ladders and through
Yeah,
tunnels and little
yeah.
trains and blowing up rocks, and it was great.
And yet some guys would last one day.
Oh yeah. Well, they'd see that cage go down with people on it, and they'd say, no, and see you later. I'm out of here.
Right. Let's talk about the Sterling Hill Mining Museum, which is in Ogdensburg, Sussex County, New Jersey. It's a very enchanting place to visit. My fine guest, Doug Francisco, still works there, not as a miner, but tell our viewers what you do there and what capacity you have
went
there.
When the mine closed, I went into heavy construction. So that was 27 years of
Right.
another life.
It closed in '86, I believe.
Yes,
Right.
the zinc company closed.
Right.
I went into heavy construction. I retired from that and came back to the zinc company, and I started as a tour guide.
Yeah.
And it was fine for a little while, but
Right.
there's so many projects that can be done there and need to be done and need to be refreshed. I mean, it's a great experience for anybody, as it is right now, but there's a lot of things I want to do. So we're restoring a caboose. Trains were very important
Wonderful.
to the mine.
Yeah. Now, I know you took me on a personal tour there.
Yeah.
Tell our viewers the distinction that mine has that nobody else, nowhere else in the world. You have the highest number of...
We have the highest grade zinc ore. Is that where you were going with that?
When you shut the lights, the fluorescent. That's what you're known for.
We are the fluorescent mineral capital of the world.
On the planet.
On the planet.
That's
there
amazing.
are other fluorescent rocks species found all over the world.
Right.
But we have the highest concentration.
Right.
There's 4,000 minerals in the world. We have 376 of them isolated in
Right.
Franklin and Oxford. 96 of them fluoresce, making us that fluorescent capital.
Right.
And 36 of those specimens are not found anywhere else on the planet. So very unique.
Do people come there whose ancestors may have worked in that mine asking for genealogical information?
Yes, we get that. Said my great uncle worked here, and where can I find his name? And you know.
And you'll refer them to the Historical Society.
That's their first.
You have a good
step.
relationship
Yes.
with them.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
So before we close, the main sources that you will use are the Historical Society in that local area or museum, and your mine in Sterling Hill has a museum. Also the census record, using the census records,
Right.
and also archives. Finding archives on your mining ancestor,
Yep.
a miner ancestor. Well, this has been a great interview with Doug Francisco, a former miner and a part-time historian and a brand new genealogist
Yeah,
to come on my show. Thank you so much, sir, for
Very
coming on
interesting,
my
Stephen.
show. Yes.
Thank you.
And on that note, as I say every week, remember, we are all descendants of ancient civilizations. Genealogy is your key to the history of your family. And so until next time, this is Stephen Conte wishing you the very best of luck in your research and above all, happy ancestor hunting. Good night.